pleased to introduce our next keynote speaker in our next panel. Juliette Majot is the Executive Director of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, which is based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The Institute envisions a food system that is good for people, for farmers, for workers, for ecosystems, and that encourages social justice globally. Juliette has dedicated her whole life to building social change. In her teens, she was part of a successful grassroots effort to halt construction of a nuclear reactor along the shores of Lake Michigan near her hometown. After graduating from Purdue University, she joined the staff of Friends of the Earth, where she worked with one of my heroes, David Brower, and she eventually served as deputy director of Friends of the Earth. She's also worked as the executive director of International Rivers Network, which is now known as International Rivers, and co-founded a very important campaign called 50 Years is Enough, which was an international endeavor against the policies and practices of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. She has consulted and shared her expertise with countless organizations, including the Ford Foundation, the Pesticide Action Network, and Oxfam America. I'm so pleased that she could be with us today and really share the work of the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. It's one of those groups that I admire because they're doing solid research, both domestically and globally, and really putting farmers at the forefront of their work. After Juliette speaks, Shruti Singh from Bloomberg will moderate the panel about the need for more transparency in the food system. So please join me now in welcoming Juliette to the stage.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be in Chicago. I grew up in Michigan City, Indiana. It's about 60 miles if you take one of the last interurban train lines in the country, the South Shore line. You can go to Michigan City, and on the way you can go past the very beautiful Indiana dunes and the equally beautiful steel mills that are built along those dunes. I grew up appreciating what it meant to have industry and what it meant to have unbelievable ecosystem, very fragile ecosystem, and what that combination meant. When I went to school at Edgewood School in Michigan City, and they used to hand out cards right at the beginning of the year, and everybody write down, where does your father work? Not where does your mother work, but where does your father work? And most people wrote Bethlehem Steel, or they wrote Midland Steel. This was the source of our wealth in our community, as well as the wealth of agriculture. The South Shore Line, interestingly, connects Chicago, the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, and goes all the way to South Bend, goes through agricultural land right there. So you get a real feel for what's going on here in the northern part of Indiana and Illinois. When I grew up, I knew that I had found something very important for times when I got a wee bit nervous, which I am right now, if you haven't noticed. And that was that I could close my eyes for just a second and remember who I was very easily by thinking about swimming in Lake Michigan in the rain and thinking about how the fast wave action of Lake Michigan forms tiny ridges in the sand on the bed of the lake. Any of you who have gone swimming in Lake Michigan know exactly what I'm talking about. So if I close my eyes and I think about my bare feet against those ridges, I know exactly who I am, and I know exactly where I came from. So give me just 2 seconds. This morning we have been listening to some incredibly knowledgeable speakers about our food systems. I haven't heard the word agriculture used all that much. I've heard the word climate change mentioned about twice. And amazingly to me, I've heard very little about the election that we just experienced. I don't know about you, but for the past, fill in the blank, I've been pretty glued to the television news, trying to understand why the election was being run the way the election was being run, why we weren't hearing about policy, why I didn't hear a single candidate talk about agriculture, why I didn't hear a single candidate talk about food systems. Why? I was buffaloed by it, but I'm more buffaloed by a lack of courage to speak out about where we're finding ourselves right now in the United States of America when we are talking about Myron Ebel, who this morning, our potential secretary of the EPA on our cabinet of our country, letting us know that there's nothing wrong with pesticides. They're not dangerous at all. This isn't an act of belief. It's not a leap of faith to talk about what we know in science about pesticides. It is not a leap of faith to talk about what we know about climate change. It is not a leap of faith to know that agriculture is going to surpass transportation as the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world. It will take over the number 2 spot, and it will do so in the next couple of years. As I was having lunch trying to figure out how to move from the talk that I was going to give to the talk that I decided I wanted to give, one of my colleagues over lunch said, you know, divisiveness breeds caution, and caution always supports the status quo. I don't think that 2 weeks ago, if this group of people, my people, many of us here, sat in a room like this, we would have tried to avoid saying the words, Sarah Palin really shouldn't be the Secretary of the Interior. Really? What are we thinking? You know, we cannot normalize what's going on, and we absolutely must place agriculture and food into the context of society, into the context of our political structures, understand that it is global in nature, that it is not something that we can control just by looking at the US food system. We're in a globalized world, and we can look at some very positive examples of how the US dealt with a pre-globalized world, if we want to speak positively, and let's do that. Let's go back to the 1920s. Let's think about how in the 1920s, family farmers were able to start their own banks in Minnesota. When family farmers were able to say, we will no longer sell our crops at below the cost of production because we insist on having some control over our supply. It took a decade, but with the Commodity Credit Corporation, for 20 years, the United States government gave loans to farmers when the price went below the cost of production. And the farmer was able to use that loan to hold their product, their crops, off the market. And by doing that, they were able to raise the price, and when they released their crops, they paid the government back at interest. The US government made $13 million on the CCC. Farmers were able to have some control over supply. Water and soil health went up considerably. So what was wrong with this? What was wrong with it was that fewer acres were being planted instead of more. And that meant that large-scale agribusiness was not going to sell more fertilizer. It wasn't going to sell more inputs. It wasn't going to have a monopoly on grain prices. And there was a concerted effort to get farmers off the land to say that get big or get out was the motto. It was a motto. It was a very well-known motto. get rid of the CCC, get a bunch of small farmers on the land, we'll give them subsidies and they can have some other jobs so that they can have a sustainable livelihood. This isn't something that is just a figment of someone's imagination. There are many, many history books written about what happened to agriculture in the United States. And this was before it became locked in and codified in international trade agreements. We have a chance right now. The question at the last panel was, what is it that we say to our new president-elect? And I have some suggestions. Why don't we imagine trade agreements that ensure every country's right to manage volatile agricultural markets and to establish strategic food reserves? Why not? Why don't we have a trade agreement that encourages constant improvement in food safety through policy and practice, including better agricultural practices as well as food inspection? Why don't we have trade agreements that strengthen greater transparency in the food system? And that's what we're here to talk about in this panel, is transparency. Why don't we have greater transparency in the food system by reinforcing consumers' right to know what is in their food, how it was produced, and where it comes from through ingredient labeling and country of origin labeling. And I'm talking about real labels that tell the real truth, not something that we can take our smartphone and click onto so that we can later find out the information we need for those of us privileged enough to have a smartphone. Why don't we have trade agreements that contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation by allowing governments to discourage large-scale, energy-intensive, and high GHG-emitting agricultural systems and support agroecological approaches? Why don't we have trade agreements that derail corporate consolidation in agricultural markets, starting with ensuring farmer ownership, use, and access to seeds and data? I'm happy to ask the president-elect to consider these things as he considers the future of food and agriculture. And I hope from our panel we can hear a lot more about what transparency really means and how our self-censoring is getting in the way of that transparency. Thanks.